For first part of today's session, I will try to tell you something about this called project planning, but it will be more specific planning. In general, I will tell you about project scheduling and how do you do scheduling in plan-driven development and agile planning. So if you look from a theoretical perspective, everything you do before you actually do something is some kind of planning. In jargon, I sometimes tell it that this is roku berzēšanas fāze projektā, how it's in English. Like, you prepare your hands for some actual work, and everything there is planning, and we already discussed this in previous sessions. For example, how do you do different kind of estimations, like you estimate first the scope of work, then features and priorities of your project, you assess different kind of risks, and you estimate how much resources you will need it and what are associated costs and time according to it. But then, when you are closer to actually doing something, you still need to do more concrete plans, and parts of these plans are splitting larger activities into smaller tasks, assigning resources to these tasks. There are two different kind of resources, who does what and what do you need as consumables for this task. Different kind of milestones where you check for something, or where different kind of deadlines happen, and what you deliver at these milestones. And in my classification, we can call this particular more concrete activity scheduling. I'm not sure that this is the most appropriate one in meaning and in terms of these things, but that's what I think you can use as an umbrella term for these more concrete activities. And either scheduling or planning, so why here are mix of different kind of terms? Probably because many of these materials are merged and got from different kind of sources, and as I already told you, according to different schools and theories and kinds of thoughts, similar things may be called differently. But so this more concrete planning in general means that you already should know what kind of team members you have in your project or team. You already should know what kind of problems you will have, or challenges, if you think that any problem is challenge to you. And then you need to go into more details about who does what when, something like this. So this is, I think, should be last stage in overall planning, or in this hand-rubbing stage of the project, because if you do more planning or hand-rubbing even after that, then something probably is wrong with your planning. And the other thing, of course, is that when a project goes forward, when time comes by, you need to update these initial plans first depending on your approach, to show and check what your progress is, and then to do more detailed plans for later stages. Depending on how seriously you do this planning in advance approach, then it may be that you have very detailed scheduling or this concrete plan who does what when. For example, for shorter time ranges like a few weeks or months, but if your project is actually for many months or maybe even for years, then probably you do not have very concrete plan for these other activities later in this time. And my idea here is to first to deal with dependencies, because you can't do everything immediately. There are many processes, many things what you have to do in sequence. First do this, then do that. And so this is my challenge for you. So it's very easy to do everything in sequence, but then everything will happen very slowly. So you need to think about how to parallelize things, what can be done in concurrent parallel approach and what can't. And then, of course, you can use this as a more concrete input or information to count concrete costs for labor, for hardware, for software, etc. And you may have this some kind of startup plan. I usually have worked at least recently, and by recently I mean some last 10-15 years, in projects where if I have planning in advance, I usually have the same level of details for entire project, not only for some stages. So in this case, what is initial project plan is actually project plan for entire project. And also, if I will have time, I will show you some practical examples. I have used this more detailed plan to calculate expenses and cost that I can give to the customer in more precise manner, to be sure that it will still be net positive project for me, considering my expenses and what I can earn from customer. And as soon as your plan is a little bit longer than 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, what actually happens is that if you do this plan in advance, project management approach, then of course you have to review these plans regularly. Good interval for regularity is approximately once in a week, like whatever you like, Monday or Friday. Then you check what has been done so far and what's your progress according to this initial way. And in plan-driven development, if you do it very in conservative way, in cautious way, then of course you have to make plan till to end of the project. If you consider something like iterative approaches and incremental deliveries approaches, end of the project may be more blurry than beginning of the project, but in general you have to create a plan with equal level of details for entire time of this project, because otherwise you are risking that closer to the end of project you will have under bigger and bigger stress that you will not be able to deliver these things at the planned milestones because you were too optimistic. So just another reminder for you, when you do your plans, you do not write your wishes. You do not put what it would be nice to have. You write realistic plans, knowing that shit happens, that employees come and go, that somebody gets sick. If you are not very cautious, you are not required to plan for financial crisis like year 2008 or pandemic like year 2021. If you are very cautious, you also need to consider that such things also happen. But the important thing is that you plan it realistically. My approach when I worked as a freelancer was that I never assumed more than 1/3 of my actual workload to work on any given project. Mostly I worked on any one single project at particular time, but you know that workload do not finish immediately after some deadlines, but it has some sustained decay of a workload, so there were some overlaps, but my cautious approach was that never estimate for anything bigger than 1/3 of time what I actually could do, like 40 hours in a week, and that was more or less proper way how I could do all the projects almost and deliver them almost on time. And by almost I mean that hit it like 80% of time, and 20% was other unexpected things. And so you need to go in the same level of detail still to the end, otherwise you may seriously underestimate how much effort will be needed to finalize different kind of tasks. An important thing about finalizing about tasks is just a reminder that usually you have very big challenges and problems parallelizing tasks at the beginning of the project and also at the end of project. So therefore you need always to remember that probably closer to the end of the project, again, there will be more and more tasks which have to be done in sequence, like you developed something concurrently in very many streams, but when you start merging things, when you have the high-level testing and deployment, you can't parallelize it very much, so this means you can't use many employees working in parallel at this stage, and that's one of the reasons why usually end phases of projects are delayed, because assumption was that everything will happen concurrently and with the same amount of speed as it was somewhere in the middle of the project. And you already should know that plan-driven development has its benefits and drawbacks. Benefits are that you have prepared in advance and you know with more or less details what will happen during project till to the end of it, and also you know what your costs will be and effort needed for all these things, and if you need to work on predicted budget, that is very nice to you because you know everything in advance. And of course drawback is that you never know very precisely all these numbers needed for all these estimates, because you need to look very far into future, and as far as you look into future, as less predictable it is. And if you need to get different kind of agreements with your customer, with other involved parties, they are very cautious because getting them signed and agreed about something is very hard. And if you do this plan in advance, then here are the sections of your plan, some part of introduction, how you organize this project. Risk analysis is very important because if you don't think about possible risks, then different kind of bad things may come to you very in unexpected way. All requirements, and so in more details I will tell you about work breakdown, project schedule, and maybe some monitoring and reporting mechanisms. And besides project plan, about your main activities or business activities, there may be different kind of supporting activities, how you manage configuration, how you deploy system depending on different kind of systems. So if you run system in the cloud, then it's usually quite easy because it's easy to automate. Everything is located in single place, even if you have load balancing and redundancy for service, etc. If you need to deploy in 100 places around the world, then of course it may be very important part and issue of entire project. How you maintain system, how you ensure for quality, and how you validate that your system is working. And even though you do planning in advance, unfortunately, this more concrete and more precise planning is iterative approach. Even if you do everything in advance, you can't write good plan in just one iteration. Even if you don't start actually doing anything, you still need to write one initial plan, then review it, analyze where are some weak areas of this, and then you need to do some changes, and changes are inevitable because when you do iterations, of course, you give this plan to review for other involved parties. The most important one is your customer, but other may be if you need to integrate some system with somebody else, if you have big dependencies like on infrastructure, software and hardware, these infrastructure guys need to review them because otherwise you may miss some important things like switching to newer versions of some tools or switching to different hardware during your project, etc. And so then you get feedback, and then you need to update that. If not everybody is happy, then at least nobody is very unhappy and frustrated about this plan. And if we look on this like a UML activity diagram, so you can do some things in parallel. So here is parallelization, like you can identify different kind of constraints about dependencies, about time, about available resources. You identify risks and you define what your milestones and deliveries be. And these of course may be very dependent on some other milestones and deliveries on which your project is dependent. So remember that during your project many things may happen. If your customer is government institution, elections may happen, and different kind of minister may be at the head of ministry, and he or she may shift his or her direction about this, and what was a pet project for one guy in ministry may not be pet project for a new guy anymore. And so different other things may happen, and as longer your project and bigger your project, more things may change during it, and you need to be prepared for that. Then you define this project schedule, and by schedule here are these more detailed plans about who does what when. And then you can do actual work and you monitor this work. And here different approaches may be that everybody monitors him or herself, like in these iterative and rapid development approaches, or there may be dedicated person who does this monitoring. Good thing about dedicated person is that it is more neutral review about how things are happening. Not so good thing is that if this is some other person who is reviewing this, he or her may not get good information about this progress from these other guys. And then you may need to redo some work if something is not finished during these reviews. Hopefully it's still before deadline. And then either you finish your project or you get into trouble, and then you may need to replan project, and replan project actually is going somewhere here, back to the beginning. And what assumptions you should have? So I already told you, assumptions should be realistic, not optimistic. Your project plan is not your wish list. Your project plan is your notes about everything what may happen during this project. Many of these things may be bad things, not good things. So then you need to think about possible problems, because as I usually tell, after some global events, there are different kind of talking heads like journalists or pundits or experts who says that after this particular event everything has changed. And I think that this is an indicator for these who talk in such ways that they were not prepared for usually bad things which had happened, because nothing changes very rapidly, because everything has inertia, and as larger scale events happen, as bigger this inertia is. But if something changed during your project very suddenly and everything has changed, then probability is very high that you actually didn't care about some undersurface movements and activities, and you just got into place and time where you couldn't ignore this anymore. So of course you have to ignore many things because you can't deal with everything at once, but you should always be prepared that things may go wrong, because in general entropy always wins. We have to put effort to make things in order. And so some of your initial assumptions may be wrong, and here again I usually tell that I'm better be pessimistic about the future than optimistic, because either I am right if some bad things happen, or I'm gladly surprised. Only drawback for such approach is that if you want to bid for lowest cost of different kind of projects and you are too pessimistic, probably your estimation for how much it will cost, how long it will take, will not be the lowest possible bid for a particular kind of project. So you need to be careful optimist sometimes, but if you do not have big overhead for management, etc., usually I won these projects when I worked as a freelancer just because I had lower management overheads, and because for small scale projects I could do it cheaper, because for large organizations they are not very effective to do small scale projects, because of this inertia and too many involved people. So it's like a truck is not a good vehicle to make a speed record. Truck is big and heavy, and it is intended to move around big and heavy things. And so also you need to include some contingency, or I call it redundancy. So you shouldn't be planning for 100% workload, and you shouldn't plan for 5 days in a week for every week, because you need to remember that somebody may do vacation and you should be able to plan for vacation, but if for larger projects you can't plan exactly if somebody gets sick, etc. So there should be some places where you can earn back some time because you already have planned for some free time, either as a not putting 100% workload, or putting 100% workload and then some 3 days in between. And so project scheduling is this more detailed plan when you start putting these things on calendar and for particular task. And task should be more or less atomic thing. There may be aggregates of tasks, but then these tasks who are not aggregates of tasks, these should be more or less independent things that you know what means doing these tasks. So tasks should represent actual activities, not some theoretical abstract process. And you should also check for resources needed. And how do you split these tasks? First, you need to estimate what are time and resources needed for it. And by time, usually you think about actual effort, not calendar time. And then you can check how this effort can be parallelized and how you can calculate actual calendar time from effort needed. And of course you try to organize tasks concurrently as much as possible, especially if its project is large and complicated and you have large team. For this team to be effective, of course you have to have particular task for each member of your team. And what makes headache here is dependencies of the task, that not everything can be done at once. You need to do something before something else, and therefore the most important thing about this more precise scheduling is to think about what may come before everything else. First, parallelization, and second, what can be done as early as possible. And again, here, usually you do it in iterations. You first identify different kind of activities. And activity may be bigger, but it may be split into tasks, hopefully concurrent tasks or tasks in sequence. Then you identify these dependencies, and if they are, of course, these tasks should be put in sequence, not in parallel. Then you estimate activities, allocate people, and here important thing is that people are not equal, and I will tell you more details about managing people probably next week. But here this rapid development approach, this iteration is good thing that for these who manage things, their duty is just to create list of tasks which should be done, and then people can pull these tasks and sign for them by themselves, depending on their interests and preferences, etc. If you do everything by yourself, of course you should know what are these needs and preferences for these people, because at least formally not everybody has the same skills and same experience. And that's also one of places where plans go wrong, is that you assume that you can assign particular task for any person in your team. Unfortunately, it is not the case. It may be in such a way, but then of course you need to know and understand that some people may do these tasks quicker and in more efficient way. Some people will need to learn new things, and if they are not actually interested about these things, of course, their productivity will be lower. And then you create concrete charts of these projects. Charts may be in different way, and then you review them, check for inconsistencies, etc. And so one of the things, of course, is you are interested about calendar time, but calendar time should not be put in stone during this planning stage, because if it is put in stone, then you already have a big problem. Because if this plan is not absolutely relaxed, something like we will do it in 200 years, then probably time constraints will make planning and management and execution of this plan probably much harder. So remember, like I told you about this Kokomo 2 method, is that you calculate plan from work needed to be done and work effort needed, depending on complexity of project, depending on how much you can parallelize it during this thing, and then you get estimate of calendar time. And if you will do it in opposite direction, almost always this time will be too short. And so about stuff, if your team is consistent, everybody has more or less the same experience and same knowledge, then that's good for you. And for example, for these different kind of extreme rapid development, they actually encourage that your team members are rotating during project in different kind of activities, that more or less everybody knows everything. My experience shows here that it should be similar to what educated person is. An educated person should know everything about something and something about everything. And I think this is also a good approach for your team members. Every team member should know something about everything for your project, and every team member should know everything about something in your project. And when you get to this stage, I think rotating your team members more in different areas probably is not so efficient and cost effective, but it is just my opinion. Your experience may be different. And so you need to remember that usually beginning and end of the project is hard to parallelize. Usually you can get busy people in the biggest number somewhere in the middle of the project, and please don't plan that you will get more people working concurrently, parallelly at the end of your project. You may assign more people at the end of project, but then definitely they will not be fully loaded, they will not be efficient, etc. So remember Brooks' law that adding more persons at the end of project will just make it delayed or even later. And so adding just more persons, people to the project means that you will spend more person hours on the project, but it doesn't mean that you will get more things done. And also you can't build up number of members in a team very rapidly because of these constraints about knowledge transfer, about teaching and learning skills for particular project, etc. So I don't know about projects, but in organizations, according to ISO standard, it is okay that if this rotation of person in organization is approximately 5-7% of total rate in a year. Why this number is good? Because usually people may get bored and tired of similar tasks, and it's actually good for them to switch to something else after 5-7 years. And of course people are different. For somebody 2 years is too much, for somebody 10 years is just okay. And what are some other problems? So other thing is that productivity is not proportional to the number of people working on a task, because adding just more people, if you are good at programming, you know that if you do multi-threaded programming, adding more threads in your program will probably just add more sleeping threads in your program if you will not give to these threads some useful work to do. And similar it's for people. Adding more people to the project, if you will not have anything useful for them to do, will be just adding more sleeping persons to the project. And so always be at least a little bit prepared for unexpected things. Probably you should not be very seriously prepared for World War III, but of course you should have some contingency, some free spaces in your project. So now about graphical presentation of schedules. There are different ways, and usually you show them graphically because in general this detailed schedule is graph from computer science perspective. And so graph are things connected to other things, and particularly for planning, it's similarly as version control and other things, it is directed graph, so it has direction. In difference with version control things, it may be graph with cycles, but good plan shouldn't have cycles in them. But there may be, for example, different kind of reoccurring tasks which you represent graphically as cycle inside your plan. And there are different approaches how you do this, but important thing is first based on time, and second based on dependencies or networks. And for each particular project activity, I will call it task. It always has duration, it has some start and end, hopefully calculated automatically, and it has estimation of effort needed. And the weight is not the same, because depending on how detailed your plan is, you may assign the same task to more than one person. I'm not saying that it is good plan, because in most of cases in IT projects, plans are not so generic that you just say 40 people will dig from here till to the midday or till to the end of project here, and everybody is assigned to the same task. But there may be such things, for example, in extreme programming, you always work in pairs, so you just give this particular task to pair of programmers, because that's how you deal with efficiency, with bugs, code readability and other things. And then there should be some kind of deadline. It may be implicit like end of task, maybe more explicit because at that point you have to deliver or review something. And all these dependencies may be managed depending on start or end of tasks or some mix of these. And milestones, deliveries are one particular kind of milestones. Milestones are in general just places where you think it is good time to review your progress. And milestones usually comes from external environment. Internally, there may be that, for example, if you work in different stages, then you think, okay, there should be milestone between this stage finished and that stage, and you review that actually everything is done. So that's easy. But when I have worked in projects, usually milestones also comes from external world, because you have to synchronize your progress with some external dependencies. So need to remember that you may put your milestones according to your assignment plan and how you think would be good workflow to do these things. But important thing is that particular milestones may come also from external requirements. And then some of milestones may require you to deliver something. And what kind of deliveries, of course, depends on project. Either documents or software for testing, or already deployed for production, etc. And in early stages of planning, spreadsheets were invented before graphical tools. What you had to do is just put everything in spreadsheet and write identifiers and descriptions of tasks, calculate effort needed, and then put dependencies here. I have never seen such thing done manually anymore, but you can generate such thing, for example, for import-export needs between different kind of tools. But what I have seen in some kind of projects is that if dependencies are very strong and important constraint for your projects, then you may represent all these tasks needed as a graph, because graph is the best way to show dependencies and what you can do in parallel and what you can do in sequence. And also what is very important here is that depending on how much time you need to spend on each of particular tasks, you can see here clearly what is so-called critical path in graph. Critical path in graph is what tasks contribute to overall length of the project. So if you here can do something in parallel and total amount of time needed is actually shorter, if something will be delayed in these other parts of this graph, actual deadline will not move. But if something will get delayed for these 4 tasks, then you will miss your deadline, because everything these tasks are contributing to overall length of the project. And the most widely used one, of course, is Gantt diagram or activity bar chart, where, so here time flows implicitly, similarly to activity diagrams, and no surprise here, because activity diagrams and state chart diagrams and task dependency graphs are based on the same graph theory. So from theory, these are just different kind of graphs with different business meaning. But activity bar chart here is like a sequence diagram where time is shown explicitly on one axis. In planning tools, usually time flows from left to right. And dependencies usually flow from top to bottom, so it is just a reminder what the waterfall model means. So you see here how this water flows or falls from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. And if something happens here during the same time, so these are parallel tasks, and these who are with some dependencies, these are coming after some time. And here diamonds usually show different kind of milestones for these graphs, and I don't know about these ones. Looks like predecessors or dependencies for these tasks. So no task inside task here, but you may create automatically aggregates of task, that there are some aggregate task which consists of smaller tasks in between them. You usually do if your project is more complicated. So that is another view how you show dependencies. So this and that is more or less equivalent, only difference is how you show dependencies and how you show exact time. But other view, very important for this planning, is staff allocation card. So here you may add different kind of memos in these things like predecessors and successors of tasks and who does what as a notes here, but then you can't see overall view how exactly everybody does something. And so other aspect of planning here is usually also managed automatically, so synchronization between this and that view in most of tools I have used is done automatically, is staff allocation chart. And what does it show? It still shows explicit time flowing from left to right, but on vertical axis you have lifelines of resources. And what lifeline is, I hope you already know from UML. Don't be surprised that these terms overlap, because again it is just science about managing resources. So here in this lifeline you can see who does what when. What is these descriptions of tasks? I don't know exactly what is this notation about these, either cancelled tasks or overlapping tasks like T9 overlapping with T10. But idea here is that another thing here is that you should review that you are using your resources efficiently, but so you try to reach 100% efficiency or usage of your resources, but you just try to get 100%, because if you put 100% usage for everybody, then your plan will not have any redundancy or contingency. So some windows here are okay. Very good thing is if these windows are actually planned, that you know that somebody need to visit doctor, somebody has vacation, etc. So if these windows are planned, very good. And if these are not planned for something specific, you still need to have some windows here. And how regularly and how much of free time, it depends on how precise your plan is, let's say so. And also you should try to not overload these resources, that like here this team member actually needs to do two tasks in parallel concurrently, task 1 and task 3. So that means either they do multitasking, this means half a day he or she, probably she, works in this task half a day on that week, or change these days in. So remember, there is not real multitasking in persons, because persons do not have concurrent processors, and so what looks like a multitasking from high level perspective in plan actually means regular switching between these tasks. And how this differs for agile planning? First important thing is that the scope of time for agile planning is much shorter, or you do something in between, because you still have these contractual obligations that you have to deliver this like in many months or few years. But because you think it's not efficient to do detailed plan for entire project till to the very end, you do precise planning who does what when only in a smaller time scale, like one particular sprint for Scrum projects. And good thing here is that you don't need to look far away into future. You don't need to agree and sign about some long-term commitments. Bad thing is that you officially know that your future is quite blurry and unknown. And here probably it comes from Scrum. You identify what kind of stories you will implement. You do initial estimation. Anyway, you need to do plan in advance. Then you release for planning. If you include particular user stories, then of course for Scrum you plan to release it in this particular sprint. And then you do planning for particular iterations for these sprints. And then you do more proper task planning. So release planning is when you need to release and deliver something. An iteration is your internal releases or milestones, let's say. Milestones without releases when you just check what your progress is and what you have done so far. And so common way how to do is Scrum projects, and I already told you about this and how you do this. And also particularly for Scrum, if you describe everything as a user story, then you just should have pool of stories to be implemented, and you take out some of these stories for particular sprint which you think you will be able to deliver in particular scope of time, like 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like this. And of course sprint should be weeks, because weekend is good milestone or border between sprints. And so that's about these things. And only difference particularly for task allocation is, and I think that's good thing, is that particularly for Scrum, if you are proper Scrum master, you just put new tasks in this backlog, and then your members of your team or of your project actually pulls out some of these tasks and start working on them as they wish. And about software delivery, you always need to remember that delivery takes some time, depending on how automated it is. As more manual labor it needs, as more time it takes. So, and what are difficulties? So for agile, difficulties is that you can't make long-term promises, but usually you still need to make different kind of long-term promises, and because of that, sometimes you can do different kind of iterations internally, but externally you still need to work on planning in advance, then fulfill this plan approach. And also it depends on consistency of your team. Agile work works in consistent teams that everybody is more or less equal in terms of skills, experience, etc. But if you have like senior members of team and junior, then probably it's always better that the senior members do planning in advance, because junior members may not be skilled enough to make realistic plans. So what are key points? So key points are that you have to plan for things, and only difference is that depending on your approach, like plan-based delivery or iterative approach, how far-fetched your plans are and how detailed they are. If you have to prepare for everything till to the end of project, then you do plan for this project with details you can afford till to the end of project. But if you do in shorter deliveries and iterative approach, then you make more detailed plans for shorter times, and then you hope that you will make more detailed plans still realistically when time will come. And there are two different kind of milestones. Milestones where you just review your progress against your plan. Usually you do not have internal milestones for iterative approach like Scrum sprints. You have milestone at the end, but not internally inside this particular sprint. But if it has longer time, you definitely should have, when you need to check what has been done so far. And remember that you may put your milestones when you think it is good time to put milestones, but you always need to check what kind of milestones you should put according to requirements from external world. Because if you have some dependencies, you need to synchronize some actions, then you may need to do some checks before some kind of deliveries and other things. And in short term, agile planning is more efficient because you don't need to go so far in future, and that's good thing. Bad thing is that then you officially know that predicting future in times far away is actually not predicted at all. And remember that things never change dramatically in short event. If something has changed in your project very dramatically, like something changed everything, then it is indicator that you were not prepared well enough, you didn't monitor your progress well enough, and you should learn something from this, and you should be more careful and more experienced in your next project. And I think that it's from me for today. Do you have any questions or comments?